Thank you for joining. I'm John Small from WTW, and I'll be moderating the discussion today about artificial intelligence and diversity and inclusion. I understand that this event has more registrants than any other dive-in event in the UK, and I think that demonstrates the level of interest there is in the topic. Today's objectives will be to recognize the impact of implications of artificial intelligence on workplace culture in general, contemplate some of the issues presented by artificial intelligence decision-making in the context of diversity and inclusion, and to explore how those limitations are likely to change as artificial intelligence evolves, and to understand the limitations of AI decision-making in the context of D&I and to explore the limitations, and to consider how the industry can mitigate specific areas of risks that AI may pose to diversity and inclusion. Allow me to introduce our panelists. Jonathan Exton-Wright is an employment partner at DLA Piper, has recently released a fascinating series of podcasts, which can be found on their website. From Singapore, we have Kamadev Chatterjee, who's an AI thought leader. He's an appointed expert at the World Economic Forum, an innovation expert at the European Commission, and a member of the Forbes Technology Council. Joining us from California at 6 a.m. in the morning, thank you, Anna Boffa, who's founder and CEO of Crate, which is an AI-powered content clustering tool. And Anna was formerly head of global community programs at Facebook. And from London, the Lloyd's Market's own Monica Stanku, who is a senior diversity, inclusion, and well-being manager and author of Building Diversity and Inclusion from Commitment to Action. In April this year, Edward Felton at Princeton University published a paper entitled, "How Will Language Modelers like ChatGPT Affect Occupations and Industries?" That paper sets out 800 occupations, roughly, and 20 industries. In the 20 industries, insurance brokers are number 3, insurance funds are number 5, insurance carriers are number 7. With the 800 occupations, my guess would be that everyone who's in attendance here would fall into the top 150. Brokers, underwriters, actuaries, claims, accountants, lawyers, and the list goes on. We're also aware that artificial intelligence and technologies like this will enhance decision-making processes, improve the customer journey, streamline operations, and potentially reduce risk exposure for insurers. So on the one hand, there's the uncertainty about how these technologies will impact the workforce and the lives and livelihoods of people in the industry. On the other hand, there's a recognition that things will be easier and better and faster, potentially for people working in the industry, but also for the client and the client experience. When it comes to diversity and inclusion, the picture becomes somewhat more opaque. And as an industry that seeks to have a representative workforce, but also serves a very diverse client base, the question for us is, as artificial intelligence becomes more integrated into our processes, how do we assess these advancements and how they impact on diversity and inclusion? I think it's fair to say that that's the context in which this discussion is taking place. So over the next hour, we'll be discussing these issues with our panelists, looking at the power and potential of AI, but also considering pitfalls, problems as it relates to diversity and inclusion. I'd like to start with you, Monica. You're the only member of our panel that works in the insurance industry all the time, and you're also the only person that has a finger on the pulse of diversity and inclusion issues. So my opening question really would be, what do you think are some of the ways that artificial intelligence can help when it comes to the diversity and inclusion considerations and the diversity inclusion space?
Thank you, John. I think there's been so much hype around artificial intelligence. There's so much investment. Some people are very excited about its possibilities, and others are really worried and cautious. But the reality is we've been using AI for a very long time already. Things like Google Maps and Alexa and film recommendations on our Netflix channel. It's here already. I think the moment that we're in right now is that we all know that it's going to really explode in the next few years, and it's going to change and transform our lives for the better in some ways, and maybe not in such good ways as well. I am personally really excited about what it can do for people from underrepresented groups, from a workforce perspective, but also from a products and services perspective, particularly in the healthcare space and when it comes to health and people with disabilities. At the moment, there are a lot of AI solutions that are able to to anticipate certain diseases. There's an application being developed at Stanford where you can take a photo of an X-ray, and in a few seconds, it can tell you if you have a tumor on your lungs or not. There's AI being used to identify skin cancers. There's an application, again, that can help you see if you have early signs of Parkinson's disease. So all of these things for people who have health issues, that's amazing. We can plan better as societies, as organizations, from the perspective of companies that offer healthcare. I think that's something, private healthcare, I think that's something, again, that it needs to be on their radar. There are also tools that have been specifically designed to help underrepresented groups. A really nice example in the US is that of robots that are using artificial intelligence to help autistic children sort of practice and identify human emotions much better. There's another example in Los Angeles of a nonprofit organization that is supporting LGBT plus young people that are going through mental health struggles. So they use AI to train volunteers at a much bigger scale and much faster to help those young people. So I'm super excited. From an HR perspective, it can help us all throughout the employee life cycle. So let's start with identifying talent. AI can help us find people from underrepresented groups that are at the moment thinking about switching jobs. So from a recruiter's perspective, that can save you a lot of time because you can target those individuals much faster, much easier. From a job ad perspective, there's applications out there that use AI that can help you identify biased words in your job ads that can maybe turn off people from underrepresented groups, women. So again, it's a tool that can help with that. There's AI that can help with listening exercises and can help you identify parts in your business that have a higher level of disengagement. So I think there's a lot of potential. I don't think we can necessarily outsource all the bias and prejudice that has existed in our society for centuries. But there are solutions out there that are being developed that I think can help with a lot of issues.
So I think that's interesting. I mean, and this kind of, and I suppose, the rate of impact of artificial intelligence on the diversity and inclusion space might leave businesses at a loss as to how they deal with these threats and manage their exposures. So, I mean, I think that's a fairly good segue into asking Jonathan about this. And just from an industry-specific focus, insurers, brokers, underwriters, what should they be thinking about when it comes to the use of artificial intelligence tools? I mean, Monica has set out broadly, I think, the various use cases. And I know that the HR one is one of particular interest to the insurance industry. But I'd love to get your thoughts on what you think in general we should be thinking about.
Well, it's an interesting question. Ultimately, of course, governments and regulators are scrambling at the moment to catch up with AI, and think we should keep an eye on what the law will be and change in the future. But I think it's important not to neglect the existing law that is already there, the existing frameworks, the quality impact assessments, equality law, non-discrimination law, workforce regulations generally, all of which will have a part to play before we see new legislation. And I think there's some risks as well as opportunities, such as Monica mentioned. I think there's clearly, as you say, there's the risk of bias, which we can come back to and dwell upon perhaps a bit later.
Yeah, that's a point I'll bring up later. Yeah.
That's also, the impact on the workforce. Will it have certain parts of the workforce may be more vulnerable, as we've seen in some of the research suggesting already that those that are underrepresented in the workforce, or gender issues, may be more impacted than others with the rollout and implementation of AI. So I think there's going to be quite a lot of thought given strategically as to what is your own ethical position, actually. Forget all the law for a moment. What is your actual ethical position? What AI are you willing to adopt? What do you wish to adopt? How does that marry up with your values and your aspirations, particularly in this space? And I think another feature which we probably shouldn't neglect is always in the employment space, you are vicariously liable for your employees if you are allowing them to use AI. And we've seen that, of course, broadcast very widely with the large language models, with ChatGPT and so on. People are suddenly waking up to the risks there. But it applies more widely in terms of rolling it out across the organization. So I think there's plenty to think about, starting off from the sense of an ethical position, creating appropriate governance frameworks, but not neglecting existing law.
I think in terms of practical applications that we can consider, when I say we, the industry, from a risk management perspective, that's key. You've mentioned ChatGPT. I've mentioned ChatGPT. I think KD, I'd like to ask you, Kamadev, I'd like to ask you your perspective on this, because obviously you're coming from a deep tech background. It's something you've done for your entire professional career. What do you think from a diversity and inclusion perspective industry should be thinking about, the insurance industry should be thinking about, and people should be thinking about?
Yeah, thank you, John. I mean, firstly, thank you and WTW for setting this panel up. I think it's very important to talk about these issues, particularly at this point in time, because the fact is that we can still make changes and we can do things at this point in time over the next 2 years, which we will not be able to do after the next 2 years. And some things that if we don't change now will become rather permanent or rather hard to change. It'll become part of what I would call the AI legacy. So we are in effect at this point in time defining that legacy. So to that point, I mean, just to step back for a second and do first, what I call, what I don't call, but people call first principles thinking. Any AI system, in a sense, is just two things. It is, number one, how it is coded to behave. So what is the actual design and coding of that design into a system that actually works? So there's that aspect of it. And the only other aspect of it is the data that it is fed to learn. AI systems today, and it's not going to be the case forever, but at the moment, an AI system is only as good as the data that it is ingesting, and it's only as good as the mechanism which it's using to ingest that data and to learn from it and to perform the tasks that it's set to do. So ChatGPT is a case in point. It started hallucinating, so to speak, that is creating outcomes that did not exist, including a whole legal case, and somebody went to court on that basis and obviously lost the case because it was completely made up. But but it was made up on the basis of a real person. So there was a real person who was implicated in a fake case, or in a case that never existed. And there are other things, like, for example, disinformation has made these models less effective, and now the chances of giving you a correct answer, objectively correct answer in certain cases like mathematics, etc., is rather low. Right? Now let's look at what that does for underrepresented communities across. So essentially, the data on underrepresented communities, particularly in the UK, but in Europe and also in the US, where, as you mentioned the other day, John, the history of redlining came from, is that over the last 100 years, the data is unrelentingly bad. If somebody goes back to data on underrepresented communities before the 1970s, it is just a horror story, because the data is mostly made up, or if it was, let's say, negative on a scale of 4 on 10, is made to be negative on a scale of 9 on 10. Is exaggerated, because you wanted to keep underrepresented communities out of functions. You wanted to keep them out of jobs. You wanted to keep them, in a certain sense, to use a terrible word, ghettoized in a certain way, not to move out of the certain boundary, not to have upward mobility, not to be a part of the top tables. And so the data was used to reinforce that. They were refused loans. They were given non-existent or bad credit scores, and even if they did things in a way that a person from a non-unrepresented community would do, they would still be tagged in some way or the other, which is known as redlining, obviously. Now, this data is the bulk of the data that financial systems today train on, because there is no other data. If you're going to go back and train on what is the credit scores or what is the lending profile of most of east of London for the last 50 years, this is the data that you're going to be ingesting. So there's very little chance that you're going to ingest that data and come up and say that somebody who comes from East London today and applies for a loan or applies for a certain function, and the AI has to make a judgment on that, there's a very little chance that that judgment will be positive, because the data unrelentingly creates what we say in AI, the mean. It's not the median, it's the mean. So the mean is already pretty bad, because the history the data has trained itself on is bad. And so even if you're above the mean, if you're nearer to the median, the difference is not enough for you to qualify and get into some of these things. This is very important for things, for example, in the justice system, where AI is now being used to decide bail applications, right? So if without considering the merits of the case, you start with a biased base, the chances of you actually saying a bail should be granted is very low. And there have been studies that showed that underrepresented communities were adversely affected disproportionately to the number of bail applicants that were denied bail, because of the AI system in training just said, oh, I automatically assume that you're the kind of person who's not going to respect bail conditions. So this is what we are dealing with when it comes to the data side of it, is that the data by itself being bad or being, let's say, biased by default, you start with an automatic disadvantage in this case, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is also about the coding side of it. The coding side, now, there things are a bit more hopeful, because you can actually train software engineers and AI engineers to understand where the biases in the coding might happen. But that's not to say that it's automatic. As you might have known of the famous cases of the earlier iterations of AI from Microsoft and others that came up with horrible results once they were released to the internet. They started using racial epithets. They started automatically painting history very negatively for Black and brown people. And Microsoft had to step in and stop that. And that was a public experiment, but private experiments have shown the same thing, that you've got to be able to contextualize the way you code for some of these things. A very famous experiment on facial recognition showed that if you had, for example, people with skin tone that's darker than a certain threshold, the AI would not recognize them as human. And they would make a decision. If the judgment was, should the car crash into that? They say, yeah, that is fine, because it's not human, So you've got some terrible examples of how bad this can be on the coding side. But the good news there is that you can train engineers and train the systems that are used for coding and checking for diversity and bias, and to remove bias. So just like today, you check code for safety and security. Is this code secure and safe? And does it meet certain coding standards for security before you deploy it? You can check that for bias too. But on the data side, I'm afraid that at the moment, the only way to really solve it currently is to do it contextually and to use regulations to enforce that. The UAI Act goes in that manner to say, look, you can't.
I mean, I think that's interesting. I'd like to come back to the regulatory piece.
Sure.
But you've talked about data and you've talked about coding, which I think, I think it's fair to say from our perspective in the insurance industry, we're likely to have a less advanced understanding of these things than you do. But I think my question would be, and it's quite a good kind of question to Monica, really, I suppose, is with that in mind, the data concerns and the coding concerns, what dangers do you see? What risks, what concerns from the perspective of workforce services, from the perspective of customers, considering a diverse customer base? What are your views on
Yes.
that?
So there are a few concerns with that. So as we were talking earlier, the system feeds on data. If the data is biased, if the data is not accurate or representative, then the output is not going to be very useful for everyone. The other problem is the lack of diversity in AI, and I'm not just talking here about computer scientists, but in general, people who are involved in working in AI. So I was reading some stats that only about 12% of AI specialists are women. There are very few professors of AI that are women or coming from underrepresented groups. Very few women or people from underrepresented groups get patents or get funding for their startups. So that means that we are building these powerful tools without having women and people from other represented groups around the table, shaping those tools in a way that works for everyone. The other problem is if you're not at the table, then you also don't get to set the priorities. Those at the table decide what's important, what are the problems that we need to focus on, how are we going to develop those solutions. If you're not there, you're not going to be part of the conversation. So I think we really need to look more into that and make sure that we don't just address the data issue, which of course is really important, and we solve that diversity data gap that exists. But we also look at the workforce, encouraging more people to join AI, and be passionate about it, because there are so many examples when things went wrong, when AI was used and we didn't think about how people from different groups are going to use those products, or how it will affect different groups. And there were some really good examples earlier, but there are some pretty dramatic examples as well. Again, I was reading in the US that a Black man was arrested because AI identified him as being guilty of doing some crime. But then it turned out that he wasn't guilty, but that man spent some time in jail. Those are pretty dramatic problems that AI has caused. So I think we really need to look into that. And then there is, if you Google it, there is a fashion company that was very creative, and they really wanted to solve the issue of lack of diversity when it comes to models, right? They wanted to have more female models from underrepresented groups. So their solution, instead of finding and hiring more diverse real models, they just created these AI models to represent women from underrepresented groups. So they received a lot of criticism for that. But again, that's maybe their intentions were good, but it didn't really land as they hoped it would land.
I see. So I mean, I think the point about ensuring that in the programming process, the coding process, diverse communities are involved, that's an important one. But I mean, I think a theme, both in what you said, in what Kamadeva said, in what Jonathan initially said, obviously, is bias and discrimination in general in the artificial intelligence process. And I think, I mean, it's made headlines, right? I mean, in our initial advert for this session is something that we mentioned. So, I mean, maybe I'll ask Jonathan this. In that sense, bias and discrimination, and potentially the propensity of AI to accelerate or amplify or renew or encourage these kinds of historical biases. What are your concerns from that perspective? Because I'll say that, I mean, obviously, the insurance industry looks and considers itself to be, well, I mean, it's financial services and it's business. And oftentimes there's a disconnect between these complex legal and or technical issues and how they filter through to how brokers, underwriters, etc., conduct their business. So what are your concerns in that specific regard? Bias and discrimination and amplification of existing biases?
Well, I think that's a very real issue. And I think it's one of very real concern, where I would say it's moving from one-off incidences of discrimination, which are equally offensive, to the possibility of systemic bias creeping into the whole situation. I think that's the principal concern. And to give this some context, I mean, we're already seeing quite a lot of HR use cases, as we all know, for example, in CV sifting, video interviews, productivity measurement, job allocations and work allocations. It's already there in the workplace and accelerating fast. And I think there's also, our own research suggests that there's perhaps a natural tension between what one might call the commercial imperative to secure the business advantage that AI represents, as against the fear of engaging with the compliance function internally and the identification of some risks. And I think we also have to remember that most organizations will be purchasers of AI. Most will not be building their own language models. That's going to be 1%. So who is buying and how are they buying is a critical issue, it seems to me. And I think the real problem is going back to the point that was raised earlier, particularly around the data sets, because it therefore means what data sets are you using? Are you dependent upon a third party's data set, or is it your data set? A good example we've seen is where, again, to pick up on some of Monica's points about unintended consequences, we've seen people try to increase diverse population of recruits by looking back to see what was successful on previous applications and using the language from those applications, only to then deploy in an engineering space very male language, which then worsened the sifting out of women applicants rather than improved it. So these are all examples, I think, where it speaks to the systemic risk. I think the other problem is that our way of dealing systemic risk is not as sophisticated as we might all want it to be, because it comes down to issues around not just governance and human oversight, but also, I think, how do you understand what's going on? I mean, if you are purchasers of AI, most of the time you're not going to be allowed to lift the lid and poke around and have a look and see how it's operating, because that's somebody else's business. That's somebody else's
the so-called black box problem.
The black box, so-called black box. So there's this lack of transparency and explainability, because it's not going to be possible to re-engineer the decision. So you're going to have to be very astute to the question of outcomes and be really on top of monitoring outcomes as one method of looking to achieve the reduction of any potential risk of bias. And just to throw into the mix there, certainly the other point to bear in mind, which I think employers should certainly sit up and take notice on, is, of course, what we call the adverse inference rule, which is a piece of lawyer's shorthand for saying if somebody can, certainly in the EU and the UK, advance a case which suggests strongly enough that there's discrimination, then the burden of proof switches to the employer to answer that it is not, to proffer some reasonable explanation. And frankly, saying the computer said no is not going to be a defense. So how are we going to tackle these very difficult issues is a big question as far as I'm concerned.
So I suppose, I mean, I'd put that question to Monica, really, and potentially to KD. How will we tackle these questions when it comes to guarding against or mitigating these risks? What do we think the steps should be? I mean, I'll start with you, Monica, from an industry perspective, potentially.
I think AI has immense potential, but we have to look beyond its technical possibilities. So we have to ask questions like, who does this technology serve? Who is creating this technology? Who benefits from it? And who is going to lose when we create all these products? So I think it's just too important to be left to a very small, homogeneous group of people. One solution, from my perspective, is to make sure we encourage more people to work in AI, not just from a technical perspective or from a different identities perspective, but also I think we need to bring people around the table that have different types of expertise. Computer scientists are brilliant, are really smart people, but they have not necessarily taken courses on diversity and inclusion or ethics or other social sciences, things like that. So that's why I think it's important that we have a really honest, rich conversation, dialogue, and debate on what AI is here to do. Is it a tool to serve humanity, to create health, prosperity for all, or what exactly is its purpose if that's not the case? And then from a practical perspective, I think some type of audits are necessary in New York, and I think Jonathan can speak on that. But they have a local law where you can't use AI in recruitment without there being an audit for bias first. So I think those are the types of solutions that might help, but I'm sure that the people that are working here with AI more closely can come up with really practical solutions as well.
Yeah, no, sure. I mean, obviously, I like the idea of audits as a former lawyer myself. It allows you to keep tabs on what's going on in the business. Kamado, I put the same question to you in terms of guarding against and mitigating the risk of bias. I mean, obviously, you've mentioned the coding piece, and I understand from you that, from your perspective, and correct me if I'm wrong, that this is a kind of key defense against bad data. But what else do you think that businesses should be doing in the industry to guard against and to mitigate the problem of historical bias and its implications for decision making?
No, absolutely. I think there's a couple of points here that Monica already referred to, and Jonathan as well in what he said so far, is that I think there is the idea of who is watching those who are coding and who's watching those who are watching those who are coding, right? So in other words, we do need to have oversight. And I totally agree with Monica that we computer scientists are not the best and having oversight over ourselves. So we need other people to point out things that we might not actually consider, both in the coding of things, but also in the contextualization and what I would call the tagging of data to remove bias, right? So this is something that needs to happen independently of the coding process. And this is something that I believe cannot be done at a company level, because this is too much for a company to do, because the amount of data we ingest is huge. Just for something simple like creating an image out of a prompt, we actually have to ingest a lot of data, and that's what OpenAI does at its back end. It does all of that data crunching, and we just get the outcome of that. So there's a lot of data, so you cannot really do that, particularly at the company level. And I also think that the techniques around data auditing for bias haven't really been industry scale yet. So we've had obviously techniques, there have been academic attempts at that, there have been different methods that have been seen, but it's time for the industry, I think, to come together and have an AI oversight board that's particularly focused on the issue of bias, on figuring out how AI companies, small and big, can collaborate and use data. Is there a way to certify data that is free of bias? Is a certification audit, as you mentioned, audit and certification process? Is there a way for us to have checks and balances, whether in real time or after effect, which actually looks for bias and tests that and feeds that back? The whole idea of white hat hackers is a terrible term, but the concept is sound, that if you take a hacker and ask them to attack a system, and they can then come up with flaws, then that helps to make the system stronger, right? So we need those kinds of techniques that have been proven in other cases in the industry to be applied. But ultimately, I think voluntary activity from the industry only goes so far, because at the end of the day, this is about competition, it's about innovation. Smaller companies may not want to open up a lot of what they're doing so that larger companies don't take over that. So you've got to do this in a regulatory way, with regulation. And you've got to say to the industry, look, if you're not able to do that on your own, which we know you can't do, then there's got to be bodies or systems or regulatory mechanisms that can be implemented to do that. So this is, I think, a problem that we've just, frankly, I think we're just scratching the surface of it. And I think that it's only going to get much worse before it gets any better. And you'll see some terrible decisions being made as autonomous driving appears on roads, and that will bring it into sharp focus.
Okay. I mean, I think I'll come back to the regulatory piece, and I'd love to get Jonathan's input on that. Because if I understand you, and from what I think you're saying, is that it's both going to be industry driven,
Right.
i.e., we need to regulate ourselves, but then on top of that, there does need to be some broader governmental, intergovernmental, international approach to managing the issue. I'll turn to Anna now. Obviously, Anna, you are a CEO. And I think the question of leadership is a key one for the industry. I will come on to the question of startups specifically, but the truth of the matter is, and I mean, someone like you will have seen this because you spent your entire career working in essentially the companies that made the modern world, right? Google and Facebook, etc. Job descriptions are changing. This is already happening. And there are concerns about the people that will be most affected first. I think the example that I used most recently was that where administrative roles are exposed to AI technology, particularly in urban centers, well, everywhere, they're often disproportionately women. And then in urban centers, they're often disproportionately of those women to be from minority communities. So from that perspective, how should CEOs be approaching the AI revolution, really?
Yeah, I mean, so like any massive kind of change in technology, there will be incredible implications, both in the short term and long term. And I think the most important thing that CEOs and leaders can do right now is to really understand it for yourself. Oftentimes, you know, when we hear about things, especially things coming from the tech world, they're from a lens that might not necessarily be as applicable to you or your business. So I think it's just really important for everyone to understand what all of this stuff is, and coming to this conference is a great start. But as many people have talked about already, AI really is, at the end of the day, about understanding how to take a data set and apply it to problems in the real world. And so I think that you as a leader should be thinking about how you can use that in your own business. I would hold strategy sessions. I would think about how it can be an accelerant for your business. And I think that the best outcome with it in regards to thinking about how to use AI is to really think about it as a co-pilot. So I'm actually more so on the positive side of will AI replace lots of jobs? I actually think it will make jobs better. I think it will allow people to have more creativity and agency in their work. I hope that it will allow people to accelerate through kind of entry-level roles or through tasks that are repetitive faster, so that they can actually have a seat at the table potentially in a way that they did not before. And so those are the kinds of things that as a leader you want to be thinking about, is not how can I replace this person, but how can I ensure that their job becomes more strategic, that I elevate the work that they're doing day to day, and how can I really take advantage of the things that they have to offer that maybe others don't. So that's like the best way to think about how to approach this opportunity space. The other thing is, I think that it will allow people to like learn about a space that they potentially did not know about before. So I like to think of AI actually as an equalizer. I think that oftentimes when technology comes into play, or when the industry that I've always worked in brings something to the market, it's oftentimes there's the fact that in the case that they're so far ahead of everyone else that there's just really this massive gap in the ability to catch up to what everyone else is doing. And with AI, again, because it is grounded in language models and data and code, it's not useful unless you apply it. And I think there's an opportunity, again, to have the input and to have the participation of groups that have been historically left out of the journey, allow them to participate in the journey. So as a CEO, you have to get creative, and you have to think about, how do I create scope for this? How do I allow and make sure that my company understands this technology? not just the leadership team. For example, with my company, even though again we've worked in the AI space for quite some time, in the early days, all this stuff was still pretty new. And so to understand it, we actually put what's called a prompt in our Slack channel. So we use this thing called Slack. Many people on here probably know it. And so what we did is we actually put a prompt in our Slack channel. And so what it meant that everyone in the company, from folks that we have that do administrative work, or admins, to folks that are handling calls and doing customer service, we allowed them to actually play around with it. So it wasn't just the engineers, it was the whole company that was calling and making prompts in a Slack channel. And they were able to create images or play around with getting it to talk to it. And that was an example of kind of introducing how the technology works to the entire workforce. And it meant that it actually changed the jobs of two of the people on our team. One of the admins came to us and said, hey, we'd like to do, we'd like to use this actually for some of the kind of email copy that we're writing. So it's about empowering people to understand the technology and then think about how they can use it to enhance the work that they're doing. And that's, I think, like the best, most positive outcome to the opportunity space.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's almost kind of democratizing the implications for your entire workforce, which I imagine is going to be key, right? I mean, if you have roles that can easily be replaced by new technology, but you are training the people who are doing those roles to actually use the technology themselves, it does change the dynamic.
Yeah.
And I'd like to focus specifically potentially on the early stage startup and or small company space. The reason I want to do that is that, I mean, you're unlikely to know this because you're not in the insurance industry, but you do have quite a proliferation, I suppose you'd say, of companies called MGAs in the insurance space. These are essentially small to medium-sized, usually, either wholesale brokers or they provide services to insurers. And dynamic space, preponderance of fairly small companies, lots being bought, lots being sold, lots being started, lots raising capital. They will often have the agility and innovation on their side, as a business like yours would. But my question for you would be probably, how do executives in companies of that size, enhance their D&I efforts, specifically with your kind of AI background and hat on, if that makes sense? What are their opportunities? What are the challenges? And how best do they deal with this world, this new world?
This new world, and it is a new world. I think that, like I was saying before, there's just a tremendous amount of opportunity right now. And I think it's really about identifying where the gaps are. We've talked about this a lot on this session today, but the challenges that we face are really linked to what the application layer is of these language models, and also who is doing the prompt engineering and fine-tuning of these models. So while you, as a small company or as a company that's maybe not tech focused, there is still an opportunity to play in this space and provide ways to allow other businesses to ensure that they're not using this in a way that could cause harm or could create more bias in work. And so I think that I would think a lot about, thinking about like the risks and how your kind of company could potentially, enhance the capabilities to mitigate risk is a huge opportunity right now. So for example, I talked a little bit about fine tuning and prompt engineering, but that is an important aspect of how you, again, create an application, meaning like you create something for this like data set, these language models to do. And I think that there's a really huge opportunity for startups to come in this space and actually provide a layer that allows and ensures companies can kind of mitigate some of that bias that exists in these data sets. So I'll give you like a quick example. So early on, when we were using a lot of this new technology, we again generate images. And so we started to notice that the image generation was extremely biased. And so it didn't have an understanding, for example, of like black hair. And so the models could not produce images of hair texture from folks from diverse backgrounds. So what we did is I actually went to all of my friends, I got people to give us pictures, and we then fine-tuned the model to understand and have this concept of differentiating straight hair from curly hair from textured hair. That literally in and of itself could actually be a startup. That could actually be a company that comes in and offers like that fine-tuning, that prompting to businesses that maybe aren't sure about what's happening with these kind of large language models. And you can create an entire list of potential business opportunities just from that example. And so I think it's really about, again, trying to understand that as a startup or as a smaller company or as a company that's not, again, completely from the ground up about tech, there are still these huge opportunities to be able to participate and support and enhance the space in a tremendous way. And I really think that this moment is very similar to what we saw like 10, 15 years ago now with the smartphone revolution, right? There are these kind of moments in tech where this wave comes in and everything changes. But at the same time, there are still huge opportunities for smaller players, right? If you think about the companies that were created 10, 15 years ago, those companies are now some of the most important companies in the world, right? And I think that there's a similar opportunity happening now. And so the key is to really move fast and to be thoughtful and to allow your teams to be creative, to understand how to capture this opportunity space. There's never really been a better time to build.
Sure. So it seems like from your perspective, the knowledge and education and training piece is key.
Correct.
Jonathan, I'd like to kind of zoom out and go back to something that Kamadev had been speaking about earlier, which is the regulatory piece. I know there are some kind of regulators in attendance, and even the regulators are trying to keep abreast of the pace of the change. So my question to you, I suppose, would be from an insurance industry perspective, considering the regulatory horizon, what should we be doing? What should the industry be doing? How should we be preparing with a view to protecting a diverse workforce and with diversity inclusion front and center in our thinking?
I think there are a couple of themes which I can develop. I mean, so first of all, I would say it harks back to understanding a proper ethical position on deployment of AI. But in that context, when we speak so easily of governance, what does that actually mean in practice? And I think it's important that within any organization, it's embraced on a multifunctional basis. It's not just procurement, it's not just IT, it's not just HR, it's not just compliance. I think it all has to come together in this space. I think it's also probably worth monitoring the progress and understanding of legislation as it's developed. And I think in that context, the EU AI Act, even though we in Brexit terms sit outside the EU, will be a lead piece of legislation which will set the pace and will govern those who want access to that market. And so therefore will have a huge influence. And I think their breakdown into, if you like, segments of prohibited use when it's dealing with vulnerable people through to high risk use is a useful way of understanding it. And interestingly enough, in the employment context, I mean, pretty much all employment decisions seem to me to be falling into the high risk bucket, which therefore dictates conformity with certain principles and also HR and human oversight. I think just to pick up on two of the themes that other people were mentioning, we talked about workforce impact, and Anna was talking about that in some respects. I think for me, a lot of people talk about it as if there'll be dramatic changes. I think there will be subtle changes as well. And for example, it'll be tasks moving to tools. So therefore, there will be parts of roles that are going. So how will that be assessed in terms of workforce impact on talent pipelines, career progression, and so on, in terms of facilitating the development of a diverse population in the workforce? There may be certain routes to progression which are no longer available. There may be new routes to progression that are available. So I think there's some interesting questions that we'll need to keep a weather eye on when we look at the workforce impact and the opportunities it creates, but also the risks to not enabling those sorts of developments.
Sure. So, we've got about 9 to 10 minutes left. And we have a couple of questions coming through, which I think are interesting. I will read one, and I suspect Kamadev might have something to say on this. Jonathan might have something to say on it. And it's this. I'll read it verbatim. It says, given what's been said around the current lack of industry understanding, governance, and whether bias already exists in AI solutions, are we already exposing ourselves to adverse risks, which could take years to unwind? Obviously, for insurers, that's a key perspective, because you often talk about a legacy and the tail of the business, i.e., you write a risk to today, and 7 years later, for example, you're looking at paying a claim on that basis. So I think that's an interesting one. Kate, Kamadev, do you have any comment to make on that?
Yes, I find it interesting that are telling in the same tone that insurers would obviously immediately go into adverse risks thinking, and I do think that actually this is quite spot on. As I was saying, we are already in the era of legacy AI risks, and it might sound counterintuitive because AI is so fresh and new, and nobody knew ChatGPT, but that's not true. It's just that they have just broken the surface. We AI engineers have been working on this for 20, 30 years. Well, I mean, I've done this for most of my career. So, we already have a lot of legacy in the AI space, which is not necessarily exposed. And the data side, there is a tremendous amount of it. And also the data itself, as we just discussed, has a lot of legacy built into that, which was not unwound. Nobody unwound some of these biases. So absolutely, as we start to deploy these solutions in a commercial sense, we start to deploy them across companies and for different user groups, we are going to exponentially increase the kind of risk. So if you were to insure a system on AI system and say, well, we think this is certifiable enough, they won't really cause any damage, and the EU Act talks about this do no harm, which initially came from Google, really, that term, do no harm kind of approach. I don't think you can actually, do that in a statistically quantifiably way that says, yeah, I'm pretty sure that there is no adverse risks already built into the system or the functioning of the system. The other point to consider is that as the systems get deployed, for each deployment, for each iteration in which it learns, remember, these systems learn all the time. Yeah, they learn 24/7 as they operate. It's not like they've learned and then they stop learning and then they operate. They continue learning. So as they get deployed, it gets worse. And a great example of this is this idea of MAD, model autophagy disorder, that if you feed disinformation or information that has been overly structured by certain LLMs into other LLMs, at some point, LLMs become completely unusable, right? So we know that AI systems, not only they come with inherent adverse risks, every operation, every iteration of that in the public domain increases those risks. And it does that not in a logarithmic fashion, but in an exponential fashion.
It kind of reminds me of almost a kind of genetic, gene recessive issues where, recursive generations, with each generation, the problem gets worse and worse. Yeah, fascinating. I don't know if you have anything to say on that particular point, Jonathan, about essentially, storing up problems for the future
I think that's right. I mean, I think, to be perfectly honest, as I mentioned earlier, there's a rush to gain advantage through AI. And I think a lot of use cases have already been deployed or are being deployed where perhaps a fuller assessment hasn't been made of the risks that attach to them. And so there will be legacy issues, I'm sure, and on a systemic basis. I think I would also say I completely agree with this sense of it being an iterative process in terms of risk management because of machine learning. So it's not just going to be a snapshot at one point in time. It's going to have to be a more sophisticated approach than that. And people are going to have to build that into their risk management and their implementation. So I think on those 2 points, I would stress there are some very real issues.
Sure. So we've got 5 minutes left. I had hoped to ask you this question potentially individually, but I mean, I had high hopes of doing lots of things in the hour. So I'd ask you to give a very short, one word, one sentence response to this question. And I'll start with you, Monica. What do you think the future looks like?
In a world where AI can do all the tedious tasks for us and we can be super productive, I think what makes us unique as human beings will be more valuable than ever. So empathy, connection, emotional intelligence, those are the things that I think will be very important in the future.
That's a nice answer. Jonathan, from AI and D&I, what do you think the future looks like?
Exciting and scary at the same time. But I think I'm hoping for Iron Man, not Terminator.
Anna?
I think that it's going to be one of those kind of revolutions that we'll always look back on and be glad that we were here for. And I think that people just have to keep in mind that this stuff is all new. And what's exciting is that it's open source. And so more people will have a say and be able to participate and help ensure that it's not harmful than ever before. And I think as someone who's been in tech for a long time, that's what I'm excited about, is the participation of many to be able to adjust and make sure that we do as much good as we can with this technology.
Yes, so someone in the industry, I would expect you to be pretty up on it. Pretty up on it, yeah, pretty up on it. And Kamadev, I'm expecting a similar answer to you. What do you think the future looks like? AI, diversity and inclusion.
I think the future is bright, but some of it will be so bright that we will be blinded. And I think some of us are already blinded, and we've got to watch out for the blind spots before we all turn blind.
It's been a fascinating discussion. I mean, the hour has flown by. I think one thing I would have liked to have gone on to address is, and it's something that I mentioned to one or two of you before, we often think about diversity and inclusion in the context of dichotomies. Forgive me, my lights have gone out. I'm gonna move around. The AI can save us from many things, but it can't save us from the lights going out. We think of dichotomies, man and woman, minority, majority, transgender, cisgender, old and young, urban and rural, etc. And the question of whether we need to start thinking about a human versus non-human dichotomy, a human intelligence versus a non-human intelligence. But maybe that's one for another day. Monica Stanku, Jonathan Exenwright, Anna Boffa, Kamadev Chatterjee, thank you for joining. I'll say a quick thank you to Frederica Moore at WTW, who was instrumental in putting this together. It wouldn't have happened without her. So thank you, Frederica. I know she's on the line. I think that's it, guys. Thank you so much for joining. And a special thank you for Anna for waking up early in California and Kamadev for staying up late in Singapore.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. See you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Bye.